Where does the Falkland Malvinas War draw its gusto from? Where does its substance? Does it draw its staying power? We got to go back in time and put ourselves in the period when this is happening. How is it that this conflict continues to move forward when it was so quiet for so long, for almost 2 centuries, or a century and a half to be precise? Not quiet actually, but the world didn't hear about it. The only ones that heard about it were the Argentinians and the British, and the islanders, I suppose. We have to go back to that period and realize that this is a tree that has its roots embedded in a fighting tree, that has its roots embedded in a ground that is composed by two different arguments, it's a confrontation of two different intentions, two different reasons. It's not two people or two countries fighting over the same thing, as both of these sides are falling into or prey to making the discussion or the dispute about. In reality, it is the confrontation of two different arguments, as if they didn't see each other now. And it happens when there is one people making nation, breaking away from Spain, in the passions, in the throes of passion, of the passion of fighting the resistance that wants to stay with Spain. They're just starting to win these wars, and now there's localized wars going on to try to establish the course of the nation. And so the sentiment is that of making country, of revolutionary new nation, defining our new border, our new singular border for our new country, which is the same thing that was happening in the States, in Mexico, in Brazil, and the whole of the American continent. The opponent is, on the other hand, preoccupied with plundering the world, trying to enrich itself off other territories. It is colonizing. It is warring other colonial empires in a competition to see who can stay with what. And so we have two completely different motivations for these islands. That is very important to point out, because it actually would directly affect a resolution that ought to be achieved, ought to be had for this conflict. It ought to speak of, because we're talking about 1833 and the denouncement claim that Argentina was expelled, its authorities, its new fledgling little administration installations, and the new people that were governing or going there to do things were kicked out, and by force, very, very subtly. And there's a reason why the British acted so subtle and so quiet about this, because at the same time they were trying to cajole Argentina into being their friends. So they really didn't want to make a big deal of it, but they wanted to keep the islands. So they went down there because Argentina, all of a sudden Spain retreated. It saw that it was too taxing on it to try to keep those little islands when all these countries were breaking away from Spain. And so it started withdrawing from the area. It left the islands. And Argentina had already, Spain had already started continued administrating the islands from Buenos Aires. And so when the Argentinians were left with more and more to do with these islands, they naturally assumed, without any agreement, without some kind of formal agreement or none of these international principles that they're saying, whether they're valid or not, it doesn't matter. These international principles arise because of this human natural rationale, why I should keep that or why that is entitled to me. And so they create poseditus jurius or whatever, I can't pronounce it, but it's basically the same thing. I don't want to get into that, but I'm going to maybe make a video only on that, because somebody wanted to make a point on why Argentina cannot use or apply that, and he actually was being contradictory. I believe it was Mr. Potts who said in the same article that he uses to sustain that Argentina would not be eligible for this, it explains that it's not to the left. It's not. It is a suggestion more than a right that this principle gives a dispute. In any case, so Britain realizes that Argentina doesn't have a navy. You know, they're using up all their men to fight the royalists and towards Peru and Chile and what have you. They're exhausted from warring. They barely can get some people over on those islands to have some order, because an American already came in a battleship and destroyed one of the Spanish Argentinian settlement that was there, and so they're like left all bruised and battered and trying to pick it up again. And so the British said, hey, let's just go take it from them, because nobody's going to defend them. They're left alone. There's no other country claiming that. This is the time. This is the time to go there. All they had to do was send a couple of ships, and basically maybe they didn't even have to bother removing the gun from the gun holster. They just walked up to the person and said, lower your flag, it's ours. And they offered some of the people to go to the continent or stay on, they did it their way. And the way that will later not provoke the appearance of aggression. It's just the way, the manner of the British have always. Anyways, that's how the conflict arises. So Argentina is left upset because they were seeing this as part of their consolidating nation. And they're thinking, these people really don't even care. They just want to grab the world. It's the confrontation of the French principles of freedom and new nations that were independence from monarchy and empires colonializing and making themselves emancipating and making themselves new nations, facing off, confronting this still powerful empire, England, that wants to continue grabbing the world, basically. And so this is what gives passion to the Argentinians, because they feel they really are right about it. They were doing nothing wrong. They were just following through in making their nation, and they didn't take English territory like the British want to say now. They just continued on what Spain was already. Spain was left there. The British didn't want to fight the Spanish. They retreated. They left Port Egmont, and they probably trying to be astute, saying, let's just wait, we'll get our chance. But the point is that they decided to leave, or recognize that the Spanish were the ones in greater possession of these islands. And so the Argentinians really just powerlessly and very meekly went on doing what they felt was their right. And the English today want to completely quash that. They don't want to talk about 1833. They don't want to get into it too much for this reason, because they don't want these aspects to be talked about. They don't want people to start thinking huge empire just grabs the islands from a country that could not defend itself, and you had tried invading it a few years before, and now you're trying to be friends with Chile to try to instigate your presence in Chile. Instigate sort of competition between it, and now so they really kind of want to move forward really quick and make the islands independent, so they can have their little New Zealand or their little, friend in the South Atlantic, and then continue. It's all strategic. It's all geopolitical strategy, it hasn't really changed since 1833. It's the same thing. And Argentina wants to just end this dispute and have their consolidated territory. In my view, they're extending themselves a little bit too much, and they're not refining. They want to have also the islands, Georgia, and that's my personal view. I feel that they have a good case with substance regarding the Falklands, regarding the Malvinas, but difficult because there have been people living there for all these since after they were kicked out, though. So anyways, but it's difficult. But if I were Argentina, I would concentrate on developing a more sophisticated understanding of the political respective realities of 1833, so that something can start getting talked about and say, well, who really then should, aside from using the law to get away with things, which powerful countries try to do, use international law to overlook the moral and the honest intentions for why they do the things they do, and say, well, let's use that law because it works for us. Instead of doing that, I think we should be braver, and we should be more courageous in changing the world and creating a fair, more just world that gets evenly distributed for the whole population, and look at the human aspect of this conflict starting in 1833. And then, as we decide, okay, perhaps Argentina had the nobler right, even though the British will say they were there first, they never had the islands because they never did not confront Spain over them. So that their sovereignty claim to the islands does not exist because they never resolved whose the islands were. If Spain and England had agreed, okay, let's split them, and Spain then left, then the Argentinians couldn't say, you don't belong here. But the Argentinians can say, you never decided with Spain. In fact, Spain stayed and you left. So the islands were really not consolidated into the internationally recognized sovereignty of a single nation ever. The dispute started on this situation. And then, moreover, the Argentinians can say, and our claim, on top of that, is one that has to do with nationhood, with countryhood, with not with colonialism or expansionism or things that are aberrant that we are seeing, we have seen are wrong, and we have been sorry, and we have created the Decolonization Committee in the United Nations. And so, since it doesn't look so good for Britain when you start talking about it this way, Britain rather not talk about it. And this is basically the reason why it has never been very bold or forthcoming in publicly talking about it comfortably. It rather avoid the subject. Argentina, on the other hand, is very confident talking about it. It will, say it to any newspaper, to any media, TV channel. The people will, an institution, recuperate the Malvinas organization, the government, anybody will talk about it comfortably. In Britain, it's all very hush-hush. We don't talk about it. And this is basically the reason. They rather not, because they know that when you start talking about it, it looks less and less good for Britain. It's the whole thing is very corrupt, very, almost, I want to say mafioso, because power, from corruption, you add power of money and the power of companies to push through and go ahead and drill in the ocean to install oil exploitation. You got to wonder what things we're not seeing are happening over there that have to do almost, that would be constituted as, could be construed as mafioso beyond corruption. They're obviously hurrying the situation. They're obviously trying to give the islanders, who before were just very calmly there, they weren't really thinking of themselves. Now there's a class of people that have one leg in Britain and one leg on the islands that are trying to make the islands more than they're trying to do quick patriotism with holidays like Liberation Day, which is an absurdity because, anyways, I don't want to get into that. I can do another video for that one. But they're trying to create more than genuine patriotism based on something that is real that you would not have to forge. They're actually trying to make it heavy financially, dependent and webbed inside the financial structure and the institution, the resource development corporations of the planet. So that way it's like sending down roots to anchor the islands, financial, artificial roots, not natural humanist roots, but means of corporation and finances that grab the ocean bedrock, and say now what are we going to do? They're drilling oil. The people that lived on the islands for some time are now becoming rich eventually. So this is obviously the British strategy. You can tell that if you've been following the development since before the war and what things happened after the war, you can see why they're drilling for oil, why they loosely and quickly gave a lot of fishing licenses. They're trying to establish. Now the whole thing is the United Nations itself has said, don't do that. Don't try to change the conditions so that you strengthen your argument later. That is not how you resolve a dispute. Anyways, there's so much to talk about. There's the decision of the United Nations to not see this as a dispute in crisis, but as a territory being invaded. It has never not been a disputed territory. This has been a territory. You pick up any map in the last 150 years, and it says in parentheses, Islas Malvinas. Yet, when it gets to the United Nations, and the junta made the bumbling mistake of trusting or believing whatever they did, thinking that Britain was going to negotiate, and perhaps maybe that's it, if they didn't have even more affirming reason to believe that Britain was not going to invade. The United Nations doesn't treat it as a reactivated conflict, or a conflict that has reached a crisis level that it never had before, and thus for that reason it is very grave. And what are we going to do? Let's push these people to negotiate now. No, the first thing they did is tell Argentina to get off the islands, as if it had done something wrong. It was a disputed territory. And so right off the bat, a lot of, you could argue that United Nations is heavily influenced by the British and by America and by Israel and so forth, and this other subject matter. And so at that moment, the English are very good at launching the right word first. So it sets the pace, it sets the tone of how things are going to get discussed or looked at, because everything is operating in the English language in the world. And so who dominates English? The English language, the British. So if something happens, they know exactly, like you would in your own language, how to semantically find the right wording, while all the other countries are still thinking, how do you say this in English? They can set the tone for things, and that's what they did when the war happened in '82. And they didn't have. We've had. I'm not going to make this more than 20 minutes because it takes all night long to upload. We have been patient with dictators, rabbit killing, massacring, genocides on their own people, and waited for years, even decades, before we made military moves. And yet, the Argentinians take over remove the Royal Marines, don't kill anybody, do not violently attack the islanders. They just kind of worked around them the best they could. They left them alone. They didn't kill anybody. And Britain only takes 2 weeks to send a full armada. There's so many things that are strange, are fishy about this war. Like, how it almost seems like they were prepared. They said they drew ships from other places, but everything fell so automatically. Now the reason, and instead of seeing Argentina as a friend country, we don't want to do this to the Argentinians, might some politician have said perhaps in Parliament. These are our friends. They're already suffering. It's not their fault. This is the murderous junta who's doing this, not the Argentinian people. Slow down. Let's try to be delicate and respectful of our friends who we have such a long. No, they immediately proceeded to treat it as an enemy country that needs to get jumped on and punished right away. And it's disgraceful as a war. This is a country that could not stand up to any of the military powers of the day. It could only have a war with one of the neighboring countries, or a small country in Africa. Not even, because they're so merciless. I mean, this is a people that do not have a war mentality. They do not hack villages. They don't have atomic weapons. They went there really learning what war is all about. While the British went there knowing they were going to win from before they left the harbor. And there's a lot of discussion on how much did the British not count on this war for their needs. And when you look at how everything unfolded afterwards, and how much it favors the reaffirmation of Britain in the islands, and how much the antagonism and the scorn and the begrudgment acquired by the islanders, obviously against the general notion of Argentina, without really knowing the country all that much, because they've always been kept not knowing each other, has helped Britain not have to try too hard. Now they will accept anything that affirms them there by the islanders. Has helped the British. You got to wonder if somehow the war wasn't really logistically not planned, but somewhere in between. Somewhere along the way, it's almost like we do. Let's do war there. Let's have this will really work for us. And where exactly and how, there's just a lot that is not known. There have been people that have already hypothesized things. How much we know already that governments agree to do things that are not what we read in the paper. We know that. And for the reasons that they don't put on the paper or on the TV channels. So, yeah, this basically it's a terrible, shameful thing. The same nature of how the islands were grabbed all the way, or finished being taken by the British in 1833, reemerges in a new era, kind of abuse of the weak, of the innocent, of the hopeful, of the trying, by a force that knew exactly it was going to win. How they could measure just how much they had, all the, they had plans just in case. What is really unnerving and offensive and insulting is not. I'm missing the right word here. Well, anyways, let's just forget that word. It's not coming back right now. That it is popularly said, we almost didn't win the war, say the British. We almost, we could have lost it. Because these are all things that try to counteract from the shamefulness of the reality, the moral, ethical reality of the war. So by saying we almost didn't win, and these kind of beliefs that are not just propagandistically spread outside the country, but also within the country. People believe that. We came close because you don't want to believe your own country is a bully that takes things from the weak. So you've got to tell your people, oh boy, we came so close to not doing good for those poor islanders. It's a good thing that we got it together just in the nick of time. In that way, you absolve yourself. But in reality, they had plans. They were going to go on. They were going to go on. If Argentina had somehow acquired more bombs, or Peru jumped in and started sending men, or some other country, Cuba, let's say, they were going to go on. They were going to start, bombing the mainland, bombing Buenos Aires until they won, because they were not going to stop until they won, as they always do, as is the nature of war. When victors feel the smell of victory, they don't just say, oh, maybe we're going about it the wrong way, or this is unethical. No, they continue to destroy the country until they get what they want. And that was going to be the outcome. They had plans already to bomb Cordoba, and secret, all stuff that is all hidden. We know about it. We talk about it today. We discuss it on Facebook, and you can pull up video to YouTube and discern people that really know and people who spew a lot of crap, and see what the behind the scenes reality of this war actually was. And again, it got repeated. So anyways, this is how the war gets its essence. This is what gives the Argentinians the passion for wanting to argue for 200 years, even past a war in which they lost, because everything is wrong and untrue about it. Nothing really corresponds to, how can I say this? The Argentinians cheered the junta when the junta surprises the country that they took the islands in 1982. Another thing that the British don't want to admit. They don't want to absolve the Argentinian people, the Argentinian nation, because that makes them the bullies. They have to make Argentina out to be an aggressive country. So they don't want to rehash facts like the fact that Argentina was caught by surprise. They could not believe it. They could not believe that the junta had invaded the islands. But the very next day, they came out onto Plaza de Mayo and cheered and cheered and cheered. So what did the British do? They used those cheerings to say, yeah, you didn't know, it was a surprise, but look at you the next following day. That's how they argue in Facebook. That's what they say. Oh, look at how you were cheering the next day. Well, what they don't care to understand, what they don't care to know, is that the people were cheering the next day, not because they attacked Britain or because they invaded the Falklands. They were cheering because finally, after 200 years, this matter of them not having justice and having to shut up about the islands and know that they should be Argentinian, but we don't talk about it because it's, there are forces there and they don't let us talk, or, the sentiment that is smoldering underneath, and we only kept it inside the country in the knowledge that these islands were about to be Argentinian all the way when they took them from the country, suddenly got reinstituted, recuperated. So the people were happy because of having acquired justice. They weren't happy because they invaded. They weren't happy because they were fighting the British. They were happy because these idiots, regardless of what they've been doing to the people, did something that we really wanted. We wanted our country to be completed, no more territorial dispute, no more hushing about we're not sure why we were taught about Malvinas and then nobody talks about it when we grow older. All this was lifted and the islands were all finally Argentinian, and this is why they were cheering. And that's without even getting into a more sophisticated sociological analysis of group celebration or hysteria, saying things, claiming victory uh, because you're happy, not because you wanted to hurt somebody. Anyways, there's just a lot that is not seen and interpreted the right way. Um, and yet the British have been very, very consistent in taking events and trying to redefine them or re-semanticize them, change the semantics by the changing the words or definitions that are used, and in order to not make themselves out to be guilty of anything, of any wrongdoing, and turn the Argentinians into just yet another irate pariah country to follow suit with countries in the Middle East and countries that are, the wrong now. And this is one of the things that hurts me personally the most, is that Argentina was free of, it was riding its own ocean. It didn't. You went to America and you saw how country after country, they were getting slammed in the news. Now these are the bestial dictators and the ones that don't know how to respect human rights. And look at what they do here and look at what they do there. And Argentina always stayed out of the news. And then suddenly the British have decided, okay, now it's your turn, and you see the same exact phrases, being used to justify or explain for the world, thanks to the fact that they have to read the English language, the explanation of things in the news and media of communication, things like the junta. We restored democracy in Argentina. Okay, this is a typical one. The Argentinians were already sick of the junta, and they were already, before the war, talking about pressuring them to have elections and to get out. And the rumors of desaparecidos was growing and smoldering underneath. And they were hated. I was there at that time before the war, and I remember they were hated. We were in high school, and we went to smoke cigarettes and all the stuff that you couldn't do because of the military. They were on their way out. But now the British like to say that thanks to them, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, democracy, Argentina, they come this close to not say Argentina was introduced to democracy when it was created a constitutional democratic nation. And all this is all the kind of embellishing and a redefinition of history that the British just can't stop themselves. It seems that they just can't stop themselves. They have to win. And I know I could continue talking about this forever, but the thing is, if you win with lies, if you win with things that are unrighteous and untrue and constructions eventually it catches up with you. I don't think the British mind this too much because they're really into the idea of buying time, and because time is the ruler of existence, and ultimately we all die, and what we're left is what has succeeded in making the definition of the world. It's a very existential truth about the world, and time is everything. So this is why countries install, for example, settlements like Israel in the occupied territories, for example, because they know that the human principle of sovereignty is very strong, and by putting people to settle in territories, you are buying time ahead of time. Sort of say you're going to be able to have a strong discourse in the future, but the intention of why you put them there is never going to go away. And we somehow intuitively know this, and the Palestinians don't forget it, and the Argentinians don't forget it, and we all know that the reason all of a sudden the Islanders, the British formalized the colonization after kicking the Argentinians off and wanting there to be people on the islands is so that they could affirm their presence, not because there was anything particularly attractive about the Falklanders that anybody for whatever reason might decide to want to go live there, about the islands. That anybody for whatever reason would want to go live there. there was definitely an underlying intention to. You could summarize that what is giving shape to any political purpose on the Falklands, even this its recent realization that they have to hurry on independence, if they want, and the only thing that makes sense, but it can't be, anyways, would make sense if it were somewhere else. Let's put it that way. If it were somewhere else, it would make sense, but it's the Falklands, and it has a very, very, very a geographic characteristic, a climatological characteristic that will never go away, and which makes brings an element of reality to living on the Falklands. And I've never been there, but I don't have to by accounts. I know enough about what it's like, the hardships. I mean, nothing grows. You can't have a tree of any kind grow, or a fruit tree or anything like that. But in any case, it's all coming about. What was I getting at? Oh Jesus, I lost track of what I was saying. But yeah, well, basically that was it. I think I went overkill with the point I was trying to make. Really, this was about just having people understand how this conflict starts. Why does it exist? Why has it been pushed forward so consistently by Argentina for so long? Because of the way it started. Because it was a nation that was proud and happy with hard work, making itself out of the colonial era, that wanted to consolidate itself with islands that it saw clearly would be part of its territory. They weren't contested by any other Spanish country. Spain was there last, you could say, just to summarize, and the English had influence elsewhere in Europe, in the world, so they knew that the English were also claiming it. The Argentinians weren't ignoring that. In fact, history shows you that some of the people that were involved with the islands were also dealing with the British. But the part of them, those that went there saying we're going to make good on Spain's possession of the islands, just believed in righteousness. They believed in God. They believed in fairness and truth prevailing. They thought if we just, we're not doing anything wrong. There weren't any other people living there before. There weren't Indians. There weren't just these colonizing empires that were visiting, coming and going, and arguing over these islands, and then both of them uninterested. And this makes more sense that it becomes part of Argentina. Nobody else would be contesting it, other than the English, that are actually wanted for colonial expansionism, for geopolitical advancement, for exploitation of the planet. So that is not so different today as it was at that moment, giving the Argentinians a clean conscience and saying we can, maybe they'll see that these islands ought to belong to us, and they won't insist. Well, the English did insist. They went back and they kicked off the Argentinians, and the Argentinians decided to not let it go. And that's basically how the conflict starts. That's what gives rise to the dispute over the territorial sovereignty. And just to conclude on a note that I think is more intelligent than saying who, than leaving us with a question of who of the two do they belong to, it's fair to say that a conflict ought to be looked at not as to, the world is not a place that we should go out to grab parts of it for ourselves. We have to share this planet among all people living on it. And that means that it makes no sense that we have a race where one country tries to grab as much as it can for itself. That just makes no sense when you think about a population that needs to share the planet and administrate it, take care of it, tend to it, and then divide living on it. So that said, it makes more sense that we look at this conflict as a matter of percentage, of amount of deserved, like a pie chart almost. That you could say, well, considering that Argentina was seeing it as a rightful part of the nation they were drawing in the south, in the southern cone for themselves, and that kind of political principle and values shoring its claim, and considering that England really wanted to have strategic land to exploit, to make work for it, to have as military bases need be, or repair bases, to continue expanding to other parts of the world and kick out all the South Pacific Islanders and take all those islands. That's the reason they wanted these islands, all of these. And considering that there are people there living now continuously who speak English, and whose families have been there since about 1846, 44, 45, 46, 48, 50, 18. Did I say 19? 1850s, 1846. And considering, well, there may be one or two people that come from before that, but generally the people that are on the island today are the people that came to the islands after the English took them away from kicked the Argentinians off. And considering that their hospitality, their habitable, how do you say this? Their habitationalness, the capacity that they have to sustain society, civilization, nationhood, people's lives in the full extent of living on this world, is what it is. It's not Brazil, as far as where you don't have any limits as far as how you could live in this world. It is very limited. It has an innate need to refer itself to its closest continental landmass. Now, this is thinking only in a very neutral human condition on this planet, premises of thinking. So considering all these things, that it makes more sense. Also in self-sustainability, we talk about least amount of time in transportation of food and in preservation of food, and it makes more sense that the islanders have farms on Patagonia where they can grow their lumber and transport it quickly to the island to build their homes. This sort of green thinking. So considering all of these things, you can draw a pie chart of proportions that you can look at, and you have Argentina, you have the islanders, you have Britain. You can see the proportions. How much does Britain really need? More territorial complications in the world. So let's say theoretically you have this diagram where it belongs to UK, a very, very slender little pie chart. You have the Argentinian reason for them to be Argentinian, not because of Argentina, but because of the islands. A very big proportion, and then that they are only the islanders, another little pie, and then you can start talking about, well, that means that then you separate sovereignty, territorial administration of resources, civil citizenship, social education institutions, and you have all these different levels, and you could design a territorial definition a kind of country particular to these islands, and all of these things that were elaborated through diagrams to finally start eloquently speaking of something, not of a fight between two opposing countries that are tugging at it like a tug of war, but rather um, a comprehensive and eloquent development of what would make more sense if we could just design from scratch a territory, perhaps create a new category of territory for island countries that are close. Well, every island has one closest landmass, I suppose, for island territories that whose people believe they want to, and it also makes sense that very detached island territories. There's always a force that is wanting them to be their own thing, but that's kind of going into another area. But one of the motivating reasons that colonies, not just because they get exploited and used, I think that even if we're talking about the colonial era, even if colonies did not get exploited and used by their empires and were perfectly fair and even in how they were administrated by the efforts and productions of their own localized earned worth and deserved keeping. I think that still there's a sense of pride and attachment to the land that would have always given birth to the idea of we're too far. We should, we love this geography that we see around us. We want this to be our country, say the people of that area. I think there's just a natural thing that arises from looking around you and saying this is the land that is our people. I don't care that our nation is also, another part of our nation is on the other side of the hemisphere. That they have a different history. They have their own geography. They have their own cultural evolution, historical evolution. We have our own cultural, historical evolution. So I think that there's a force there, anyways, that was just playing alongside, playing with the other reasons that created the stronger cries for independence in colonies during the colonial era. And as such, after having had a war and so much, perhaps at some point, if the war hadn't happened, I believe we still had a chance that the islanders would have accepted becoming Argentina and then having a real autonomous society, a real autonomous independent economy, even perhaps in some way. But now there's this sentiment as it's almost like saying your relationship with your friend or your loved one or your parents or what have you, somebody that matters in your life, is fine until the day they hit you, until the day they did something really bad. And it seems and you can be friends again, you can be a couple again, you can forgive your parents or you can forgive your children, but now if there's a definition, a description of your relationship that includes that and it's no longer the same, I think that if the islanders were capable of really seeing the Argentinians and seeing the Argentinians afflicted by this smaller incisive force that is the military occupation, that they got out of their own military institution, that got out of their hands and started attacking them, there might be a chance that the islanders could forgive the Argentinians, but then they would have to kind of grow in this kind of academic understanding of the world and know much more up close and personal the Argentinians to see that they really never had any intention to ever invade us. They liked us. They were curious about us. If they were to discover that on their own, that was the case before the war, there is a chance that maybe something along the lines of the war never having happened could continue to develop. But in any case, as I said, there's still this idea that if you have to live on these islands so differently geographically and climatologically, you hone a different character almost just by living there. There might always be the spirit of, but we are different. We are islanders, and we come from a different cultural background anyways. And so such a breakdown of diagrammatically of history that gives percentages and amounts and proportions of each category regarding sovereign right, regarding political right, regarding earned effort of contribution and investment, which you could say was pretty strong on the side of the Argentinians. That things would come from the mainland before the British took back the islands, I believe. And we consider all these things, then you can start saying, well, a territory that is sovereignly this way, financially this way, civil and citizenship and social educational institutions this way. One of these levels can be more completely independent. Another one can have ties and flows to Britain. Another one can be part of Argentina. And all of this creates a conjunction with its own perimeter that ends up being the nation of these islands. Whether they maintain the same names or they change the name. And this, I believe, would be a good solution for the Argentinians, because what it would give is the Argentinians a chance to invest in their own efforts, in taking people over there and building and bringing their culture, which is what they were robbed of. Later, this whole tug of war, primarily led by the British, turned it into what you really want is the oil and the resources. And then Argentina started saying, those are our natural resources that you are ransacking. And it became about what the islands are worth. But I think that what hurts a people and a nation is a little bit deeper than that, is the fact that this was going to be part of our country. This was going to be part of our nation. We have folklore. We would have had gauchos that came from Malvinas as part of our patrimony today, and we might be using some kind of device in the country that has to do with something that was invented in Malvinas for the winters, and now we use it in the Pampas. This aspect of nationhood, I think, is what hurts the deepest. So by the Argentinians having a chance to go and, I don't want to say play, but sort of play country, and a lot of the hurt, the offense, the humiliation would be healed. There would be a chance for that to, and that would resolve a lot of, if not most of the conflict. And of course, then we're talking about something that the Argentinians are sick of, and it's always the reoccurring fight of how much power and financial and industrial influence Britain has over the continent, how little sovereignty the Argentinians, compared to what they would like to have. They would want to have developed their own country, and yet they don't have the means to as much as they would like to. So there's always this acceptance of foreign. We're talking about a problem that is prevalent in all of Latin America. The lack of saying, okay, we got to start at level 1 or 2. It's just the way it's got to be. We got to build our own in order to not have this constant popularism against liberal economics, constant back and forth, is ultimately destroying the countries. Consolidate ourselves and grow and meet the Europeans, the Asian countries at their own level of sovereign wholeness, and then start on a, after we match their level, then start on an even exchanges and trades and collaborations. But right now it's just based on receiving help, and that is just destroying their own sense of worth. or assistance or loans. This invention of the loan with interests is just not letting the world move forward, basically, and making very few richer. So it would be possible to find a resolution to the conflict. So I ended up doing almost an hour again, and then it's going to take 5 hours to download. But at least I covered how the conflict started, and the nature of the conflict, and why there is a fair and just, there is the plausibility and the possibility of a fair and just, equitable resolution that is good and giving to Argentinian, Falklanders, and the British. And it can include all three in one solution for the territory. Absolutely, it can be achieved. It can be achieved. You have to break it down. You have to go to where people are uncomfortable rehashing and talking about again and find, okay, this is what we got to work with. Because what would make it fair is that indeed the islanders, this is the islanders' home. I have an argument going with a friend, an Argentinian, because he looks at it more from legalities, and he said it's, and I'm not talking about whether it's their rightful home legally in international law, or would be international law that is fairer than the ones that is being used, the ones that are attempted to being forged into serving the British for their purpose. I'm talking about what the human heart sense of homeland is, which is what gives rise to the writing of international law or countries' laws, how we feel, the emotional part, the part that we know, to existential, intuitive sense of our being alive and interacting with one another is what we desire, what we feel, what attracts us, what we desire. And then when that gets challenged or assaulted, then we create, we try to install it in the form of formal administration or laws or principles that we set down on paper with ink, and then we try to go by those. But they were written circumstantially on something that happened somewhere in history, somewhere in the world, and then when we try to apply it differently in at a later date in history, they're imperfect, and so there's nothing wrong with looking at the human structure of values and saying, well, it is the islanders' home now, for better or for worse. Whether they were brought there to colonize, doesn't matter. It's been their home now. That doesn't mean that the political argument between Britain and Argentina cannot be resolved, and that perhaps, indeed, ultimately, it makes more beneficial sense to the home of the islanders for them to have a certain level of their nation be part of Argentina to an extent, or at the levels that would have spun forward from certain things being dealt with honestly and with acknowledgement and recognition. And as it turns out, other aspects that they really didn't get a chance to develop or earn, because they never installed factories on the islands. They just wanted it to be part of their country. So at the very basic belonging, sovereign level, maybe Argentina has an argument, but then it was the islanders who actually built the islands, or the British for the islanders. And so they don't have an argument, even though it might hurt the Argentinians to recognize this. And so then we have another level that speaks more of how we run things, how we operate things, how we run our economy, how we live, how we educate. That would be very different to those levels in the Argentine nation being even among all provinces, for example. So the concept of an independent province would be speaking about that, would be talking about a province that Argentina has rights, civil citizenship rights, territorial rights, but as far as how you do things there, it could not. It could be not the say of the Argentine government as to how things are done on those islands. This kind of fusion or hybrid solution could be achieved in a way that that doesn't infringe or curtail on any of the islanders' islands, their home islands, or their lifestyles as they are now, as they have always known it, and leaving it open for them to continue growing as much as they can on these islands. And still address and heal the Argentinian claim and sense of having been treated unjustly in the past, which they were, and thus balancing and restoring their sense of righteousness about these islands, without maybe it looking the way some imagine it now, that should be the entire archipelago should be Argentinian and the British should go away or something like this. Without it ever being that way, it could actually, the Argentinian claim could be satiated, could be satisfied, could be addressed, and could be resolved. In working with precision, sophistication, articulation, and recognition, going back to the past and each side recognizing what perhaps we weren't right about. And this would give room to the other side accepting what we were right about instead. And if everybody did that, then something new could arise, a new creature, a new type of territory that would finally be a truly sovereign, self-determining society, civil society, islands, and whose description of the territory resolved finally the Argentinian claim, addressed how much right Britain had, or maybe it's time for, it's not that Britain lets go of the islands is not actually something that Britain would be so. I think Britain too also has its own interests. So what are those interests? Let's just say them. We want to be able to have a place where we can refuel our ships on our way to explore oil on the parts of Antarctica that we managed to agree were our domain. Instead of thinking when we think of the world needing to be shared among all people in all countries, we sober up and we decide things that would come easy to. Argentina wants to have some of Antarctica to develop its country. So does Chile. So does Britain. Other countries, Norway, Australia, China, I don't know, everybody's got a little claim on Antarctica now. Why do they have to overlap? Why do we want to exist with disputes and unresolved matters? Disputes and unresolved matters make it are more than burdenful and contradictorily complicated and snag us and draw us back and push us back. They could, if you look at why we want to claim these territories, we could all agree that, well, we could still have all those things if it was 2/3 of what we're claiming. Argentina gets 2/3 of what they're claiming. Chile gets 2/3 of what it's claiming, and Britain gets 2/3 of what it's claiming. You will see that there's no more overlap. Why is that so difficult to just sit down in an afternoon on a piece of paper, work it out? I hope that somehow perversely and corruptedly or perversely, we're not entertaining fight and conflict and contradiction because it helps us elbow one another to have a better, a greedy hope of us winning more than the other next to us in the future. I hope that the Malvinas wasn't, that the Falklands wasn't this for the British. That we continue to argue over it instead of resolve it. It means that we will always be able to blackmail Argentina at some level. We will be kinder about or maybe there's a chance that we'll give you back the islands if like a bargaining chip. I hope the countries don't see that and realize that don't think of it that way, and realize that what is most important, what behooves every people in every nation, is to consolidate their nationhood, their sovereignty, their integrity, and be self-reliant, and work on being able to make, produce, and achieve and advance along the means that every other country has and is able to. Not use another country in order to, serve ourselves. We should all be self-sufficient and completely mature in our own right. For everything that science and everything that countries and technologies are able to do in this world, whether it's to put something, every country should put someone on the moon, I was going to say, or develop some kind of technology. We should all be, I think Argentina has always seen it that way. They always try to have a little nuclear program, a little space program, a little this. It's very difficult to create the whole sense of all that the world can be, nation, in a competitive world of countries trying to seduce you with credit or overlapping territories or things that force you into competition or tempt you into an easy advance or tempt you into a fast lane that would be a fast lane, and in reality ends up making you incapable, impotent, indebted. So the principle of mature whole integrity for each nation is very important in Gaia humanist politics, in my view. It is important that we come from a position of power and then are able to give more than take from each other. If all nations give each other in collaboration, then it works out. There's no debt. There is learning from different ways of doing things that we went about it differently, and these other countries, the same thing is done their own way differently, and so we enrich ourselves. We don't indebt ourselves. We have to come from a position of self-empowerment and giving, not latching each other to depend on us or anything like this. And this mainly starts speaking of the financial structure of the world, doesn't it? Okay, well, it ended up being 1:08. Let's see, when are we going to stop it? I look at numbers a lot. Thanks for listening. I'm thanking those who actually stood to look at my chubby face, because this time it looks really wide for some reason, for 1 hour and 8 minutes. Thanks.